Married Jesus by Lois and Abrahams. When Melody told me what her sister was up to, I was flabbergasted. For one thing, I'd never thought of Carrie as a spiritual seeker. I knew she was dissatisfied with her job at the auto parts store, dissatisfied with her friends and her life generally, but I just never expected her to go that far afield. I didn't even know she was Catholic. My daughters hadn't ever been very close. Like my twin Nancy and me, they were just litter mates. More trouble to raise, but no identical cuteness factor to mitigate the slog. No secret language, no eerie bond connecting them. So I would have thought she would tell me or her dad instead of Melody before running off to Mexico. Certainly before taking a vow of silence, although it's not like she speaks Spanish anyway. There's a website, Melody told me as though that explained anything. It's a real thing. Cults have websites too, I said. What was she thinking of? Melody stubbed out her cigarette and gave me a shrug. I don't understand my daughters. My two girls, now 23, seem mostly depressed. Though whenever I had mentioned this, thinking that a diagnosis is halfway to a cure, a hopeful step in the right direction, they sighed and shrugged and looked away. When I was their age, I was exuberant, wildly excited about finally being an adult, off the leash at last. I ran around taking drugs and sleeping with beautiful bearded boys, writing songs and poems and dancing in the rain, dancing around fires, dancing wherever there was music. And there was music everywhere. We cared about everything in those days. That was then, Mom. My daughters like to say it's now. And they look away and take another drag on a cigarette or paw listlessly through a stack of junk mail or find some other way to express how boring everything is. So I was encouraged in a way by the amount of initiative Carrie had shown, though still bewildered. Some guy she met told her about it, Melody said. She lit another cigarette and continued sorting the kids' laundry, most of which was an unhealthy grayish pink color. My grandchildren, Kyla and Barry, dressed like orphans, in clothes you wouldn't even give to Goodwill. But Melody says they don't care, they just get dirty again. I guess she thought it sounded cool. Melody's phone started a drumbeat and she picked it up and started pushing buttons. It's Matt, she explained without looking up. It sounded way uncool to me, and I felt the cold panic I had felt on the few occasions when I mislaid one of the girls. Like the time Marcy Prentice, like an idiot, had her teenage son do her carpool pickup after swimming lessons, and he had come home one girl short. I drove to the Y with my heart thumping, Melody whining in the back seat about missing that SpongeBob show, and rounded the last corner to find Carrie waiting patiently on the sidewalk, her pink purse over one shoulder, blonde hair dried into chlorinated strings, gym bag held in one hand ready for departure. I jumped out of the car to envelop her in a hug, wanting to hold her sweet little face between my hands and marvel at her continued existence. But she had already slipped into the back seat with Melody, leaving me standing on the curb. Let's go, Mom, Melody called to me as I stood there still shaking. Goosebumps is on next. But why, I wondered, would some guy she met be talking about a nunnery? Met where? Sounded wrong to me, especially with a name like that. Sisters of Divine Suffering. I talked over with my husband Ron after dinner that night as we finished off a bottle of Chianti. You wouldn't think, to look at him, that Ron had shared my crazy youth with me, that we had met over a tab of LSD. He was no longer bearded or long-haired or brown and lanky, as he had been in what we now call the 60s, though the excitement started out late in that decade and hung on for a while. Balding, just the mustache now, round-tummied, he was still a good looker, at least to me, but no longer the hippie god I had hooked up with. He didn't think there was any cause for concern about Carrie. "She's trying something new," he said. "I thought you would like that." After a certain amount of persuasion, Ron agreed that maybe we should look into it just to put my mind at ease. So he Googled the name of the organization Melody had given me, Sisters of Divine Suffering, and after clicking past a few pages of links to porn sites, he brought it up on his screen. It was the most primitive cyber presence I had ever seen. It made me appreciate how much design went into even the crummiest websites. There were no ads, not even for prayer books or retreat centers. No banners, no headings, and no links. The only graphic was a line drawing in wavering red strokes that probably represented the convent building, set precariously on a mountainside with a long series of stairs leading up to a tiny door. The text in single-spaced 10-point Comic Sans MS read, "Sisters of Divine Suffering is Red Sisters, founded St. Agnes of Siena in the 15th century. Originally from Belgium, now has a single-end cloister in the hills north of Santo Domingo, Aguascalientes, Mexico. The sisters have vowed remaining silent and give their earthly bonds. They are dedicated to a life of prayer. We are trying to experience the suffering of our Lord on the cross to save share for a clean and hello world." The rest of the screen was white. We stared at it together. "Okay," said Ron, "that's pretty weird. It's not how humans make websites." "Did you know she was into religion?" I asked. But Ron just shook his head and bugged his eyes out a little. It wasn't just the girls. This whole family seemed to communicate through a system of nonverbal gestures and expressions, which was fine, but I'm not sure I always understand. "Use your words," we used to say to the girls when they were little. "I hate to think she's buying into the whole Christian thing," Ron said. "Why not something mild like Buddhism? Or just flirt with transcendental meditation like we did?" I hate to admit it, but I've always had a soft spot in my heart for the whole Christian story. You can't really get too down on the baby Jesus and the lambs and all that, for one thing. And I even had a nice feeling about the Easter part of it. God deciding to find out for himself what all the prayer and lamentation was about by slipping into a people suit and joining the fray. I imagine the interest he must have felt in all the strange routines and practices and vulnerabilities of the living human body. I especially appreciated that Jesus didn't opt out of the crucifixion, which theoretically he could have. No, he saw the whole thing through to the end. So that's what they're always complaining about, I imagine God thinking. Oh, the agony and sorrow and betrayal, the flesh assaulted, the hopes dashed, the efforts thwarted, the life ended just as it was getting good. How about if you call Melody, I suggested. Sometimes they tell you things they don't tell me. Ron pulled out his phone on the spot and had Melody on the other end in no time. And it turned out there wasn't a whole lot more to tell. Mexico, he told me, but we knew that. And her new name is Sister Mary Jesus. It was no longer a question of if we should go, it was how. Ron had been to Mexico during his dope days, so he was enthusiastic, even though he didn't seem to share my sense of urgency. I called Nancy to tell her what was going on and asked her to feed the cat while we were gone. She wasn't as appalled as I thought she would be as a rabid anti-Catholic and devout member of a series of increasingly bizarre Pentecostal churches. She said she always told me I should have taken those girls to Sunday school, but at least it wasn't meth. She had seen a show about meth on TV, and evidently it was rampant. The previous week it had been West Nile virus she was on the lookout for. She agreed to feed the cat and bring in the mail and keep an eye on things until further notice. After looking at travel websites, maybe locating the convent on the map, though the image was blurry, Ron and I decided to take a train from Juarez and then a taxi to get around Aguas Calientes and thereabouts instead of driving. We planned to pay for a Pullman car with a bed so the train would travel through the night and we would wake up in the heart of Mexico, rested and ready to search for our lost or wayward or beatified daughter. Of course, it didn't work out quite that way. The train was noisy, not in a soothing way. The doors opened and closed, the engine roared and clanked, and we stopped too many times to count, waking each time, checking to see if we were there yet, and trying to sleep again in the few hours that remained. We pulled into our station much too early in the bright, busy morning on market day, just as the stands were being set up, leaving the cool, dark station and emerging into a scene too confusing for my brain to register. At first, the taxi driver squabbled over us in high-pitched Spanish, but once things were finally sorted out, we were linked up with Pedro, who assured us that he spoke English very well, muy bien, and that he liked hippies, though how he saw through our respectable veneer is beyond me. He seemed to like us, though, so we didn't try to correct him. Pedro was to be our guide as well as our driver, and he said he knew all about the Sisters of Divine Suffering and could easily drive us out to their encierro whenever we wanted, anytime, night or day. We thought we would like to find a good, cheap hotel first, and it turned out that Pedro's sister Dolores ran the best in town, El Monte. Very cheap, very good. He started the car with a wrenching sound and pulled out into the street to the accompaniment of the Rolling Stones doing Under My Thumb, nosing his way between short, dark people with baskets, bags, animals, enormous plates on their heads, and the vendor stands where all manner of smelly, ripe goods for sale were stacked as high as the people's heads. The overwhelming impression was of movement, color, and vivid smells of ripe and rotting fruit, shit, and people. Busy, 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 and all I wanted was to sleep. Look, Pedro said, pointing ahead, la religiosa, the sister, like you say. Between the golden mangoes of one stand and the bright red meat of the next, almost invisible in the mosaic of color, stood a figure draped in white from head to toe. I strained to see her through the dirty car window, this sister of suffering. Her face was white like a cave animal, and the cloth around her face was even whiter. She carried a market basket hooked over one arm. As I watched, wondering who she might be in my daughter's new life, she took up 5 mangoes and offered the vendor some coins. I was surprised to see that he held out a handkerchief for her to place the coins in, turning his face away. Why? I asked Pedro. Why the cloth for money? Why not just hold out his hand? El mano, I said, holding mine out in pantomime. Oh, dos religias, Pedro said, shifting gears and turning round to talk. Touch the sleeve, he said, pulling at his own shirt to demonstrate. You are sad all day. As we threaded our way through the market, I kept noticing how careful the otherwise heedless people were to avoid contact with her, even in this jostling crowd, opening to let her pass and then closing in her wake. They won't touch her, I said, but Ron hadn't seen it and misunderstood. No, he said, she'll be fine. Carrie's a big girl, don't worry so much. El Monte Hotel was close by, and though the room was a little Spartan, I was too tired to be picky. I wasn't on vacation after all. I was on a mission to save my daughter. I slept for just an hour or so, then went down to find Ron and Pedro chattering away in Spanish in the lobby, with Dolores in a red muumuu reading a magazine and fanning herself, her black hair floating back and forth in the small breeze she generated. The day promised to be a hot one. Now, I said, I want to go to the place now. Pedro ushered us back out into the warm street, and his brightly decorated taxi, now rocking with Pink Floyd and the Dark Side of the Moon, Having rested up, I was able to appreciate the dancing of the scarlet fringe glued around the windshield and notice the little picture of Jesus on the dashboard, his big red heart on display outside his robe, his hand raised in admonition. I thought that if we saw another nun on the way, we could offer her a ride. Maybe she would be able to talk if she was off campus. But that didn't help. Instead, we drove out of the city into the hills around curving roads, dodging buses that honked either in greeting or warning, and people returning home from the market. Chickens and goats and pigs crowded onto the road at times, and we had to stop and push our way through them. Pedro honking and talking to us over his shoulder, though I couldn't understand much he said either in Spanish or English. I just thought about Carrie, and I pictured her, ensnared by grim-faced fanatics, beaten and starved, made to suffer for them, trapped in a sweating cell, calling out for help, absorbed into a blank-faced community of zombies, a bug in amber, a fly in a spider web, a leaf in the flood. Just as I had come to the conclusion that we were hopelessly lost and would never arrive, we stopped, and for the first time, I saw the place that held my daughter up a long flight of stairs, just like on the website. It was smaller than it had grown in my imagination, but there was just the door with a barred window in it, the rest of the wall blank and stained. I took Ron's hand and we started up, but Pedro stopped us. "No mans," he said, "just over the missus." "Go ahead," Ron said, "find out what's going on." It was even more of a climb than it looked like, and each step seemed steeper than the last, so that I was panting when I got to the top, my heart hammering alarmingly in my chest. I knocked. No one answered, so I knocked again and shouted, "Hello," and then, "Hola," and kept up the banging in a way that I hoped would communicate that I was not going to give up. The door opened just a crack. "Hi," I said. "I'm the mother, madre of one of your group." "And Carrie," I added. Then, "Sister Mary Jesus." I hoped it didn't sound as stupid to her as it did to me. "I want to see her now." The crack opened a little wider, and I saw a spectral white figure there, holding her hand outstretched, fingers spread, cocked at the wrist, so that I could have given her a high five. "What?" I said. "I don't understand." And she pushed her hand out again, so presumably that was all the information she could offer. The door closed. I turned and looked down the long fall to the taxi where Ron and Pedro were looking up at me. I duplicated the nun's gesture and saw Pedro nod. "Cinco," he said when I drew close. "Come back at 5. He held out his watch for me to see. It was 3:35. "A las 5 de la tarde," he added. I couldn't bear the thought of driving away, so Ron agreed we could sit in the cab and wait. Meanwhile, Pedro played the soundtrack of my entire youth on his tape deck. Every song seeming to quiver with hidden messages, dark premonitions, cryptic promises or threats. I didn't remember the music sounding so sinister, so cruel, but I remembered the phrase "strung out" we used to use to describe the state I was in, kind of wide-eyed, ragged overload of the senses. At 5 exactly, I knocked again and the door opened immediately. I didn't wait for an invitation, I stepped inside. The room was dark and cool compared to the harsh sun outside, and it took me a while to get my bearings. A little nun stood in front of me, her hands folded peacefully, her habit rustling as she turned and ushered me toward a narrow table, one chair on each side, where I presumed the interview was to take place. I sat heavily, my knees unexpectedly buckling. "I want to see my daughter," I told the sister, but she had already disappeared down a curving hallway. "I want to see her now, at 5, 5. And there she was. Carrie took the chair across from me. Her face was pale, but she'd always been very fair, prone to sunburn. I couldn't read her expression at all, and since she sat still as though cast in stone, There were none of the shrugs or sighs that might have told me anything. "I am so happy to see you," I said. "How are you, honey? Are they treating you well?" She remained impassive, immobile, and silent. I told her I just wanted her to be happy. I said, "If you want out, Carrie, I'll take you home. We can walk out of here today. If they're holding you by force, just wink and I'll come back with as many men or men with guns as it takes to break you out. Just one wink. No one but me can see you. I can get you out of here." I studied her flat eyes, darker than I remembered in this dark room, waiting for the anticipated wink until my own left eyelid began to twitch. I would do it. I would move heaven and earth, I thought, to save her from this grim silence. "Carrie," I pleaded, "just tell me." With what might have been a smile, Sister Mary Jesus reached out across the table with both her slender hands, a gesture of generosity or a challenge. I thought her hands would be cold, but they were entirely room temperature, like things, as though they had no life, as though they were part of the room. I don't know how long we sat like that, hands joined across the table, face to face. The contact was so intense and so immediate. I didn't have time to think about how I must have looked to her. I was too intent on seeing her, taking in her flat, knowing eyes, her thin cheeks, the faint circles under her young eyes. As we sat there, I felt a string of pain threading up my arms, growing and stinging, like a transfusion of poison working its way toward my aching heart. I tried to pull away, but Sister Mary Jesus held my hands tight, and I was trapped in the circuit of pain that joined us, that used us both. Tide after tide of anguish jolted me, washing through me, rendering me defenseless on a shore outside of time. This, the suffering of the cross, this, the unending stream of suffering my daughter had sought, chosen, and embraced. My breath came in short jabs of air, and just as I thought the slicing pain had become intolerable, I felt a quiet singing in my head, a hum of pure pleasure. Nothing as soft and expansive as joy, but a sharp, gleeful, almost malicious exhilaration, a selfish bliss. And across the table in that cold room, Sister Mary Jesus smiled into my horrified face. Finally, she released me, and I ran, leaving my daughter imprisoned there in her ecstatic agony, saving only myself. I don't remember the ride back to El Monte, only that I cried, and I could not stop crying, even when the sobs that shook me felt more like vomiting than weeping. I couldn't feel sadness or fear, just the paroxysms that racked me. Ron held me as well as he could, but clearly he was worried. Pedro just nodded. Tequila was all he said. So I spent the evening getting sloshed on tequila, drinking, throwing up, crying, then drinking some more as the crying fits gradually became less violent. I stopped around midnight, my belly aching and my head abuzz. Pedro, who had stayed with us either out of a sense of responsibility or a fondness for Ron, or possibly for tequila, was still there when I fell asleep. I tried to explain it to Ron the next morning, grateful that he believed me. I tried to compare it to LSD or peyote. Like a bad trip, he suggested. The worst and the best, I said. Roller coaster kind of thing? Not even, I said. The worst and the best, all at the same crazy time. I never tried to explain it to anyone else, but I did go by the apartment to tell Melody it was true and that Carrie had not wanted to leave the order and come home when given the opportunity. I thought she'd want to know. Okay, she said, her eyes drifting toward the flashing television screen, looking over the three heads lined up on the couch where Kyla, Barry, and Matt, her live-in, sat eating Cocoa Puffs almost in unison, mesmerized by the movement of the cartoons, lost in the unreal. She loves her kids, I know, but Kyla's hair was matted and stiff, and both of the little ones looked pallid in the half-light. Matt, the latest of the string of guys, unemployed, apathetic, was just a bigger kid she did laundry and bought groceries for. No passion between them that I had ever seen. I looked around the apartment where she lives, my daughter Melody, with nothing beautiful on the walls and nothing an actual human had created anywhere. And I couldn't see anything to love in the stained, standard, synthetic, temporary, caged, regimented, lost world she has accepted as though she has no choices. I felt a dull aching in my veins where agony had once run, this time a pain that brought no corresponding unearthly delight. And that's the part of the Jesus story I don't buy anymore. The whole Savior thing that's supposed to make sense of it. That's the real suffering of Christ. Just hang there on the cross and look around, realizing that you do what you can, but you can't save people from hell. You can't save people from anything.